My name is Emily Carter. I'm 41 years old, and I design buildings for a living. That night I was standing backstage at the Ohio Center for Architecture, waiting to accept the Sustainable Design Excellence Award for a community health clinic I'd designed in the Hilltop neighborhood of Columbus. A project I'd fought for, underpriced, and lost sleep over for 2 years. My husband Dan was in the third row with our kids, Max and Lucy, dressed in clothes they hated. My business partner Sophia Wren squeezed my hand before I walked out. My mentor Howard Lynn, 71 years old and the reason I still had a career at all, sat near the front with his cane and his good suit. And my father, Richard Carter, had asked to say a few words before I came up. A father's pride, he'd told the MC. A nice touch. He walked to the podium in the navy blazer he wore to every occasion that mattered to him, cleared his throat, smiled at the room the way he'd always smiled at rooms, like an insurance man closing a deal. Some of you know my daughter, he said. Some of you might remember she had a rough start. This is Emily. The one who didn't make it until apparently she did. The room laughed. A polite, uncertain laugh, the kind people give when they're not sure if they're supposed to. I was still behind the curtain. Nobody saw my face. That was the only mercy of the evening. I want to tell you how I got there. To that curtain, to that laugh, to 12 years of being introduced by my own father as a joke with a punchline attached to my name. It didn't happen in one night. It happened slowly, the way most things that break a family happen slowly, with birthdays and bank statements and a grandmother's trust fund, until the night I finally understood the whole shape of it. If you're the kind of person who's ever been the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who just can't seem to get it together in a family that decided that story before you were old enough to argue with it, stay with me. I think you'll recognize some of this. And if you do, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. This channel exists for people like us. Subscribe if you want more of them. Let me take you back. I was born the second child and the first disappointment, though it took years for anyone to say it that plainly. My brother Brandon came 4 years before me, and by the time I could talk, the roles in our house were already assigned. Brandon was the golden one, good grades without trying too hard, good at baseball, good at charming my grandmother Eleanor with the kind of easy affection that made adults melt. I was the one who cried too easily, asked too many questions, and once at 7, took apart my father's garage door opener to see how it worked and couldn't put it back together. My father called me the wrecking crew for a month. He thought it was funny. I thought it meant something true about me. My mother, Diane, was not a cruel woman. She was a tired one. She'd married my father at 22, and by the time I was old enough to notice patterns, she had learned the family currency. Keep the peace, agree with Rick, and love us both the same amount out loud while, privately, giving Brandon just slightly more room to be a person and me slightly more correction. My grandmother Eleanor, my father's mother, was different. She'd been a schoolteacher for 31 years, and she had the patience of someone who'd spent 3 decades with other people's children. She was the one who noticed when I was building things instead of breaking them. She bought me my first drafting set when I was 12, a gift my father called a phase in front of her and a waste of money once she'd left the room. Money moved through our family the way water moves through old pipes, quietly, and always toward the path of least resistance. My father worked as a regional manager for an insurance company, comfortable but not wealthy, and he treated every dollar as a referendum on a person's worth. Brandon got a car for his 16th birthday, a used Honda Accord because he'd earned it with his grades. I got a bus pass at 16 and a lecture about how not everyone gets everything. I don't tell you this to make my childhood sound like a tragedy. It wasn't. There were good days, Sunday pancakes, a lake house we rented every August, my grandmother's Christmas Eve dinners where she let me help her set the table with the good china. But underneath the good days, there was a ledger nobody spoke of directly. Brandon was the investment. I was the experiment. By the time I left for college, I understood my job in the family. Don't cost too much and don't need too much, and maybe eventually you'll be forgiven for not being him. The first firm. I studied architecture at Ohio State, worked 2 jobs to help cover what my parents didn't, and graduated with more debt than Brandon had when he finished medical school, because his tuition had come with quiet checks from my father that mine never did. Nobody called it favoritism. It was called helping the one who needs less help less. At 29 in 2011, I made what I still think was the right decision made with the wrong partner. I co-founded a small architecture firm with a classmate named Nathan Cole. We called it Cole Carter Design. We had 4 employees, 2 real projects, and a lot of hope. 14 months in, I discovered Nathan had been billing clients for work we never did and pocketing the difference through a shell subcontractor account. By the time I found the discrepancy, a $38,000 invoice for structural consulting from a firm that didn't exist, he had already emptied our business account and disappeared to Arizona. I was left with the debt, the lawsuits from 2 furious clients, and a firm that folded within 3 months. I was 30 years old, newly married to Dan, 6 months pregnant with Max, and personally liable for $11,000 of business debt that took me 4 years to pay off. I called my father the week it happened. I remember the phone call almost word for word, because I've replayed it so many times it wore smooth like a stone. I told you not to go into business with people you don't really know, he said. Not are you okay? Not what do you need? Just the sentence he'd clearly been saving. Dad, I need help. I might lose the house. You won't lose the house. Dan has a job. A pause. This is what happens, Emily. This is what happens when people rush into things. He never lent me money. He never offered to. What he did instead was tell the story at Thanksgiving that year. Emily's little business thing didn't work out, in the same tone he might use for a science fair project that hadn't gone as planned. And somewhere in that retelling, over years of retellings, didn't work out became didn't make it, and didn't make it became who I was in that house no matter what I did afterward. If a hidden financial betrayal in your own family is starting to sound familiar, you're not alone. I promise the discovery in this story goes much deeper than what happened to me. Keep going. Rebuilding quietly. I did not disappear. I want to say that clearly because for years my father's version of events made it sound like I had. 18 months after the firm collapsed, an architect named Howard Lynn, who'd been a guest critic on one of my grad school juries years earlier, called me out of nowhere. He'd heard what happened to Cole Carter through a mutual colleague, and he'd heard it the way people in a small professional community hear things, mostly true, slightly exaggerated. I'm not calling because I feel sorry for you, he told me over coffee. I'm calling because I looked up your senior thesis project again last week for an unrelated reason, and I remembered you were good. Good survives bad partners. Are you looking for work? I started at Lynn Associates 6 weeks later as an associate architect at 32, with a newborn at home and $11,000 of debt still hanging over me like weather. I worked harder in those years than I have ever worked since. By 36, I was a senior associate. By 39, Howard made me partner, and 2 years later, when he began stepping back toward retirement, I bought out enough of his share, alongside a talented colleague named Sophia Wren, to rename the firm Carter Wren Architecture. None of that made it into the family story. What made it into the family story was a single sentence, repeated at enough holidays that it calcified into fact. Emily had a rough patch after that business thing. Never Emily rebuilt. Never Emily made partner. Just the rough patch, preserved like a specimen, brought out whenever it was useful. I didn't understand yet how useful it was about to become. The golden standard. While I was climbing back from zero, Brandon was living the story my father told about him at every gathering, and for a long time I believed it as much as anyone. He'd finished his cardiology fellowship at 31, and taken a position at a well-regarded hospital system in Columbus. He married Chelsea, a former flight attendant with a talent for making every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her, and they bought a 4-bedroom house in Upper Arlington with a down payment my father called responsible saving at every dinner table it came up. What my father did not say at those dinner tables, what I did not learn until much later, was that the responsible saving had included a $60,000 gift from my parents in 2014, structured on paper as a loan that was quietly forgiven 2 years later. I found out about the forgiveness by accident from my Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, who mentioned it in passing at a barbecue in 2019 as though I already knew. Wasn't that generous of your dad, she said, wiping that loan for Brandon and Chelsea right before Tyler was born. Rick said family should help family. I remember smiling and saying something neutral. I remember doing math in my head instead. The $11,000 I'd repaid myself dollar by dollar against the $60,000 quietly erased for my brother, and deciding the way I'd decided 100 times before, that this wasn't a fight worth having. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was the year I started, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping a folder. The folder. I want to be honest about how it started because it wasn't dramatic. I didn't sit down one night and declare I was building a case against my family. I was an architect. I kept records the way I kept records for everything because unclear information eventually costs you money or worse. After the barbecue conversation with Aunt Carol, I started a simple habit. Anytime money came up in a family conversation, a loan, a gift, an inheritance comment from my grandmother, a mention of my parents' will, I wrote it down in a private note on my phone. Date, who said it, what was said. Nothing more. I told myself it was just curiosity. Some quiet part of me knew it was something else. By 2021, the notes filled 11 pages. A $15,000 wedding contribution to Brandon and Chelsea in 2016 that had never been offered to Dan and me in 2010. A 2018 mention from my mother that your father's been helping Brandon with the mortgage, a little that was never explained further. A 2020 comment from my grandmother Eleanor, made quietly to me alone in her kitchen, that she'd asked Richard to make sure things were fair between you two in the will, followed by her asking, almost nervously, "He is doing that, isn't he, honey?" I told her yes. I didn't actually know. A quiet folder, a suspicious answer from a grandmother who wasn't quite sure of her own son. Write that down because it comes back later. If stories like this keep you up at night the way they keep me writing them, subscribing helps more than you'd think. Eleanor's kitchen. My grandmother Eleanor turned 86 in the spring of 2021, and she was by then the only person in my family who consistently made me feel like the folder wasn't paranoia. She lived alone in the same house on Deschler Avenue she'd lived in since 1968, refusing every suggestion that she move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. She still did her own grocery shopping. She still did the crossword in ink. But that spring I started noticing small slips, a forgotten doctor's appointment, a story repeated twice in one visit, a moment where she called Lucy by my name and looked briefly, genuinely frightened by her own mistake. My father was, on paper, wonderful about it. He visited her every Sunday. He'd taken over her bill paying to make things easier for her. He had power of attorney, set up in 2019, which no one questioned, because who would question the responsible son helping his aging mother? I visited on Wednesdays after work with Lucy, who Eleanor adored. It was on one of those Wednesdays in October of 2022 that Eleanor said something that lodged itself in me and never fully came loose. "Your father asked me to sign some papers last month," she said, stirring sugar into tea she'd forgotten she'd already sweetened. "I don't remember what they were for. He said it was for the house insurance. Do you still have a copy?" I asked as casually as I could manage. "He took them with him. Said he'd keep them safe." She looked at me over her glasses and for a second, the fog cleared completely, the sharp woman I remembered from childhood suddenly present. "Emily, if something happened to me, you'd make sure things were fair, wouldn't you? Between you and your brother?" "Grandma, nothing's going to happen to you." That's not what I asked. I promised her I would. I didn't yet know what fair would end up costing me to protect. Christmas 2022. We hosted Christmas that year, which almost never happened because my father preferred hosting so he could control the seating, the schedule, and the toasts. But he and my mother were having their kitchen renovated, so for one year, the Carter family gathered in my dining room in Clintonville, at a table Dan and I had built ourselves out of reclaimed oak the year we bought the house. It should have been a good night. Max was 14 and sullen in the specific way 14-year-olds are sullen, but he helped Lucy 9 set out place cards she'd made with glitter glue. Aunt Carol brought her famous green bean casserole. Uncle Gary, quiet as always, complimented the house's structural beams, which I appreciated more than he knew. Then my father stood to make a toast, glass of Malbec in hand, and said the thing that made the whole table go still for half a second before everyone moved on the way families do. "To family," he said, "who take care of each other. Brandon's always been the one I could count on. Steady, reliable, doing exactly what he set out to do since he was a kid. And to Emily, for finally landing somewhere good after a few detours. 12 years after Cole Carter Design, 8 years after making partner at Lynn Associates, 2 years after founding my own firm, a few detours." Dan's hand found mine under the table. Brandon, to his credit, looked uncomfortable, glancing at me with something that might have been apology if he'd had the nerve to say it out loud. Chelsea refilled her wine glass and complimented the tablecloth. My mother asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. I said thank you for the toast, passed the potatoes, and went back to my folder that night after everyone left, adding one more line. December 2022. A few detours in my own home in front of my children. That was the same week Max, unprompted, asked me at bedtime, why does Grandpa always say stuff like that about you? I didn't have an answer that felt honest and appropriate for a 14-year-old at the same time. So I told him something true but incomplete, that some people show love badly, and that it wasn't about me being wrong. He didn't look convinced. Neither was I. The text I wasn't supposed to see. In March of 2023, my phone and Brandon's phone were, for reasons neither of us ever solved, still linked through an old family plan text forwarding setting our father had configured years earlier for emergencies. It malfunctioned exactly once, forwarding a group text from my father to Brandon onto my phone instead. Rick Carter, talked to Martin today. Told him to draft it the way we discussed, house and the account go to Brandon primarily, small share to Emily so nobody can say anything. She's fine, she doesn't need it like you do with Tyler's school coming up. Don't mention this to your mother yet, she'll want to discuss. I read it 4 times standing in my own kitchen. Martin, I knew that name. Martin Doyle, the family's longtime attorney, who had drafted my grandmother's original will in 2015, back when the plan as my grandmother had described it to me herself, had been an even split between Brandon and me, plus a modest bequest to Aunt Carol. I did not respond to the text. I did not confront Brandon. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time and then I opened my folder, and I wrote the message down word for word with the date and a screenshot attached. A misdirected text is rarely an accident of fate in a story like this. It's a crack in a wall that was already failing. What Emily found next confirmed it wasn't the first crack. Stick around. What fair was supposed to mean? I called my grandmother the next day, not to tell her what I'd seen, but to ask gently whether she remembered what her will said. Your father handles all that now, she said. He said it's simpler if I don't worry about the details. Do you remember what it used to say? Before Dad started handling it? She was quiet for a moment. It used to say everything split evenly, between you and Brandon, and something for Carol. Her voice sharpened briefly with the old clarity. Has that changed? I don't know, Grandma. I'm trying to find out. Find out, Emily. I want it to be fair. I've always wanted it to be fair. Pause softer. I worry your father doesn't see you the way I see you. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of the money, I want to be honest that the money itself was never the wound. Dan and I were comfortable. My firm was doing well. What kept me awake was the sentence, she's fine, she doesn't need it like you do, because it meant that 12 years after Cole Carter Design collapsed, my father was still using my worst professional failure as a permanent excuse to give my brother more. Not because Brandon needed more, but because it was easier than admitting he'd never really believed in me to begin with. The hospital bill. In June of 2023, Eleanor fell in her kitchen and broke her hip. She was rushed to Riverside Methodist Hospital, and for 4 days our entire family reorganized around her. Visiting hours, hospital coffee, the particular exhaustion of waiting rooms. It was during that week that I learned 2 things that mattered more than the fall itself. The first was that Eleanor's hospital bill, after insurance, came to $9,400, and that my father paid it directly from Eleanor's own account, the same account he controlled under his power of attorney, without ever mentioning to Brandon or me how much money remained in it, or what else had come out of it over the past 4 years. The second was smaller, and it happened in the hospital cafeteria, where Brandon and I found ourselves alone for the first time in months. You look tired, he said, which from Brandon was practically an admission of feeling. I am tired. I hesitated, then decided to test something. Hey, has Dad ever talked to you about Grandma's will? Specifics, I mean. Brandon's face did something complicated. A flicker of guilt, quickly smoothed over into his easy hospital corridor smile. You know Dad. He likes to handle things his way. I try not to get in the middle of it. Being in the middle of it seems like it might already be happening, Brandon. He didn't answer that. He looked down at his coffee, and for one honest second, I saw something in him that looked almost like shame. Then he said, Tyler's got school stuff coming up. Private school's expensive. Chelsea and I have been stretched thin, if I'm honest. He looked up. Dad's just trying to help where help's needed. It was the closest thing to a confession I would get from him for another year. A hospital room can crack a family open faster than any argument. Emily was about to learn exactly how deep that crack went. In a spreadsheet she never should have seen. The spreadsheet. I found it in September of 2023, and I did not go looking for it. Eleanor, recovering from hip surgery and moving slower than she used to, asked me to help her find an old recipe box in the study of her house, the one room my father hadn't yet reorganized for her convenience. While searching the desk drawer for the recipe box, I found a green folder labeled, in my father's handwriting, Household Miscellaneous. Inside was a printed spreadsheet, dated August 2023, titled Family Support, Running Total. It documented in my father's meticulous insurance man handwriting turned into careful columns, every dollar that had moved from Eleanor's accounts and my parents' own savings toward Brandon's household since 2014, the $60,000 down payment gift, forgiven in 2016, a $22,000 contribution toward Tyler's private school tuition, spread across 2021 and 2022, an $18,000 payment in early 2023 that the spreadsheet labeled only as B. CC debt do not mention. At the bottom a final line dated just 2 months earlier. Total to date, $137,600. Emily. Birthday gifts wedding $15,400. Difference to be addressed in estate planning per discussion W. Martin. 62023. Difference to be addressed. Not corrected. Not made fair. Addressed, the language of a man managing a liability, not a father reckoning with the debt of love he owed his daughter. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to leave the folder exactly as I'd found it, exactly where it had been, and I drove home that night without turning on the radio, because I needed the silence to hold what I now knew. The question I asked in the dark. Dan found me at the kitchen table at 11 that night, the photograph still open on my phone, untouched dinner plates from hours earlier still on the counter. Talk to me, he said, the way he always did, without demanding I be ready before I was. I showed him the spreadsheet. I watched him read do not mention twice, his jaw tightening the way it did when he was angry on someone else's behalf, which was the only way I'd ever really seen Dan angry. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I don't know yet. I closed my eyes. I keep thinking about the 18-year-old who watched her parents forgive a $60,000 loan for her brother's house while she was paying off $11,000 in business debt $100 at a time. And I keep thinking, that girl needed someone to tell her the story wasn't true. That she wasn't the one who didn't make it. She was just the one nobody bothered to be fair to. You could tell your dad that. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever. I could. I looked at the phone screen again at B. CC debt do not mention, a phrase that would have destroyed Brandon's careful image of himself if it ever surfaced at a family dinner. But I don't think this is a conversation. I think it's a pattern, and patterns need proof, not feelings. If I go to my father with feelings, he'll do what he's always done. Tell a smoother story and make me sound unstable for objecting to it. So what does proof look like? I didn't have an answer that night. But I knew with the same clarity I felt when a building's structural plan finally revealed why it had been failing, that I was done writing sad little notes in a private folder. I needed something that could survive daylight. She had the spreadsheet. She didn't yet have a plan. What she needed next was someone who could tell her whether what she'd found was a family wound, or something the law had a name for. The lawyer's office. I called Martin Doyle's office the following week, not to accuse him of anything, but because I remembered he'd drafted Eleanor's original will, and I wanted carefully to understand what estate planning per discussion W. Martin might actually mean. Martin, to his credit, would not discuss my grandmother's specific documents with me. Attorney-client privilege, he explained gently, belonged to Eleanor, not to her son, and certainly not to me. But he agreed to meet with me off the clock as a family friend in a general sense about elder law. His office was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian downtown. All dark wood and the smell of old paper. He was 60, gray at the temples, the kind of quiet, careful man who chose his words the way I chose load-bearing walls, knowing that one wrong placement could bring the whole structure down. Generally speaking, he said, folding his hands on the desk, if someone holds power of attorney for an elderly parent, and there's reason to believe they're using that authority to redirect assets for personal benefit, their own or another family member's, that's not just an ethical problem. Depending on how it's structured, it can constitute financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law. There are protections. Guardianship review. In serious cases, criminal referral. I'm not trying to send my father to prison, I said, and I meant it even then. Most people aren't, Martin said. Most people just want it to stop and want the person they love protected. The two goals aren't always separate, Emily, but they don't have to be pursued the same way. He looked at me carefully. Do you have documentation? I told him about the spreadsheet, the misdirected text, my folder of dates. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalculating a case in real time. If even half of what you're describing is accurate, he said, you don't need to raise your voice at Thanksgiving. You need a paper trail stronger than the one your father built to hide from. And you need to talk to your grandmother's actual attorney about her actual capacity and her actual wishes, which, by the way, is not me anymore. Your father switched her to a new firm in 2021. I only found out because Carol mentioned it to my wife. That detail, the quiet switch to a new attorney 2 years after Eleanor's first small memory lapses, sat in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. Priya's office and what fear actually costs. I saw my friend Priya Nair for coffee 2 days later, not as her client since she was a therapist and we'd agreed years ago never to cross that line, but as the person who'd known me since architecture school and had watched from the outside every version of this story unfold. You look like you're building a case, she said, before I'd even sat down. I am building a case. Okay, then let's talk about the case you're not building, the one about what you're actually afraid of. She stirred her coffee, unhurried, the way she always was, which used to frustrate me and now steadied me. You've spent 41 years being the one who didn't make it. If you do this, if you expose what your father's done, what happens to that story? I hadn't let myself ask the question that plainly. I don't know. Maybe it finally becomes obvious that it was never true. Or maybe he finds a new way to make it my fault. That I ruined the family over money. That I was jealous of Brandon. That I couldn't just let an old woman leave her money however she wanted. And if that happens, then I survive it, I said, and surprised myself by how steady my own voice sounded. The way I survived the first time he decided who I was. Except this time I'll have the truth written down. Priya smiled, the small, careful smile she gave when she thought I'd said something worth remembering. That's the whole thing, isn't it? You're not trying to win an argument with your father. You're trying to stop needing his version of you to be wrong before you can believe your own. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, I think I've been afraid that if I make him face it, I'll lose the last chance at him ever being proud of me. Has he ever given you a real chance at that? Or have you just kept hoping the next time might be different? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both already knew. The people around her, a lawyer, a friend, a mentor, were becoming something more than support. They were becoming witnesses. What she built next would need every one of them. Building the timeline. Over the next 6 weeks, I did the quiet, unglamorous work that no one puts in the highlight reel of a family reckoning. I requested my own bank statements going back to 2010 to document exactly what I'd paid. And when, on the Cole Carter debt, proof that the rough patch had been a fully repaid, fully resolved chapter of my life, not an ongoing failure. I asked Aunt Carol gently, over a lunch where I told her most of what I knew, whether she'd be willing to write down what she remembered about the loan forgiveness and the will conversations. She agreed, her face pale, saying only, I always wondered why Richard got so cagey whenever Mom's will came up. Uncle Gary, quiet as ever, turned out to be the most methodically helpful person in the entire family. A retired accountant, he sat with me one Saturday afternoon and helped me organize the spreadsheet photographs, the misdirected text, and my own decade of bank statements into a clean data timeline, the kind of document, he said, that a judge could read in 10 minutes and understand completely. You know, he said, sliding the finished folder across his kitchen table, Carol and I always thought something was off. We just didn't have proof. You built proof. I met with Martin Doyle again in November, this time with Uncle Gary's timeline in hand. Martin reviewed it in near silence, occasionally making a small sound of confirmation, and at the end closed the folder carefully. This is enough to request a formal accounting of your grandmother's finances, he said. And enough, frankly, to petition for a guardianship review if her cognitive decline is as documented as you say. I'd recommend you get her seen by a geriatric specialist independently, not through your father's arrangements, before we go further. Everything after that depends on what she wants, and what a doctor confirms she's still capable of wanting. I called Eleanor's primary doctor that week and arranged, quietly, for an independent cognitive evaluation the following month. Thanksgiving 2023. We hosted again that year, an accident of scheduling that felt, in hindsight, like the universe setting a stage. I did not confront anyone at that Thanksgiving. That's important to say because if you're expecting the big scene here, it isn't coming yet. What I did instead was watch, really watch, the way I hadn't let myself watch in years. I watched my father carve the turkey and make a toast about family loyalty that no longer sounded like warmth to me. It sounded like a man rehearsing a defense. I watched Brandon avoid my eyes every time money came up, even in passing, even about something as small as splitting a restaurant bill. I watched my mother refill wine glasses and steer every conversation away from anything with an edge, the way she'd steered conversations my whole life, and for the first time, I felt something closer to pity for her than anger. And I watched Eleanor, sharp again that day, tell Lucy a long story about teaching third grade in 1974. Her voice full of the same clarity I remembered from childhood, before quietly turning to me in the kitchen while we did dishes and asking, "Did you find out? About the will?" "I'm finding out, Grandma. I promise you I'm handling it." "Good." She dried a plate slowly. "I don't want to cause trouble. I just want it to be right. You were always the one who noticed when something wasn't right, even as a little girl." It was, I realized later, the truest compliment anyone in that family had given me in 12 years. And it came from the only person who'd never once called me the one who didn't make it. One quiet compliment from a grandmother who still saw her clearly, and one carved turkey later, a doctor's report would confirm exactly how much time Emily didn't have left to waste. The doctor's report. The independent evaluation happened in December of 2023. The geriatric specialist, a careful, kind woman named Dr. Osei, no relation to David Osei, who you'll meet later, spent 90 minutes with Eleanor and called me the following week with results Eleanor had authorized her to share. "Your grandmother has mild cognitive impairment," Dr. Osei told me. "Not dementia, not yet, but a level of impairment that would make her vulnerable to undue influence in complex financial decisions, particularly if she's not receiving independent counsel. She's still capable of expressing clear wishes about simple, direct questions: who she loves, what she wants for people she cares about. She's less capable of catching complicated language in legal paperwork, or noticing if a document has been altered from what she remembers agreeing to." "Is that enough for a guardianship review?" I asked. "It's enough to justify one. Especially paired with financial documentation showing a pattern of one-sided transfers. Whether it's necessary depends on whether your father is willing to correct course voluntarily, once confronted properly." I thanked her, hung up, and sat with the diagnosis for a long time. Not because it surprised me I'd watched the slips for 2 years, but because it made everything else undeniable in a way my folder alone never could have. My grandmother was not simply an old woman whose son was managing her affairs. She was, by clinical definition, a vulnerable person whose son had positioned himself as her only financial gatekeeper. Right around the same time he'd quietly changed her attorney and begun forgiving debts and funding tuition for one grandchild while calling the other fine. I called Martin the next morning. "I think it's time," I told him. "For what, exactly?" "For me to talk to my father directly. Not to destroy him. To give him one real chance to fix it himself before we do anything formal." I paused. "And if he doesn't take it, I want everything ready to move immediately after." Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's the right order," he said. "Most people want the confrontation before the preparation. You're doing it backwards from how it usually goes wrong." What I did with the weeks before. I spent January of 2024 finishing what Martin and Gary had started. I opened a new, separate account for our own family's savings, unlinked from any shared family accounts my father had ever had access to. A precaution Dan and I had honestly been slow to take. I updated our own wills, naming guardians for Max and Lucy explicitly, a task I'd put off for years and finally finished in a single focus weekend, as though clearing my own house before inspecting someone else's. I met with Karen Boyd, a financial advisor Sophia had recommended, and asked her hypothetically what it would look like to help an elderly relative establish an independent trust with a professional trustee, removing any single family member's unilateral control. "It's very doable," Karen told me. "It's also very common. Once families understand it's an option, it removes the moral weight from any one person having to be in charge of grandma's money, and it removes the temptation entirely." I printed Uncle Gary's timeline in triplicate, one copy for myself, one for Martin, one sealed and given to Aunt Carol for safekeeping, in case anything happened to mine. I told Priya what I was planning, and she said only, "You're not doing this for revenge. I want you to hear yourself say that before you do it." "I'm doing it," I said, "because my grandmother asked me to make it right, and because I'm done letting a story that was never true decide what my children think a father looks like." She nodded. "Then you're ready." Everything was in place. All that was left was the room, the table, and the moment Emily had spent 14 months preparing for, though even she didn't expect it to arrive the way it did, at her own award ceremony, with her father holding a microphone. The award ceremony. I told you where this story started. Now you know what I was carrying with me when I walked out from behind that curtain. The Sustainable Design Excellence Award was for the Hilltop Community Health Clinic, a building I designed at cost for a nonprofit serving one of Columbus's most underinsured neighborhoods, funded through a combination of grants and a fee structure that barely covered our overhead. It was professionally the proudest work of my career, not because it was flashy, but because it mattered to people who rarely got buildings designed with them in mind. David Osei, president of the Ohio chapter of the American Institute of Architects, had asked if a family member might say a few words before I accepted. A nice tradition the chapter liked to include. I'd said yes, thinking of my mother, secretly hoping my father might, for once, rise to an occasion built entirely around my success. Instead, I got the one who didn't make it, until apparently she did, delivered to 200 of my professional peers, my mentor, my children, and a local news photographer capturing the event for the chapter newsletter. I walked out from behind the curtain into that laughter, that uncertain, cruel little laugh, and for one full second I felt 14 years old again, standing in a kitchen being told a garage door opener made me a wrecking crew. Then I looked at Max in the third row. His jaw tight with an anger he was too young to have earned on my behalf. I looked at Lucy, confused, glancing between her grandfather and me. I looked at Howard Lynn, who was not laughing, whose face had gone very still and very focused, the way it did when he was about to say something important in a design review. I took the microphone from my father's hand, and I did not raise my voice. "Thank you, Dad," I said, "for that introduction." I let the pause sit exactly as long as it needed to. I want to tell you what actually happened after I didn't make it. The confrontation, part 1. I did not, that night, unveil the spreadsheet, the misdirected text, or Eleanor's diagnosis. That was never the room for it, and I knew it. What I did instead, calmly, in the same measured voice I used to walk a client through a difficult budget conversation, was correct the record. In front of the one audience my father had never expected to see the truth arrive before he could reshape it. 12 years ago, my business partner embezzled money from our firm and left me holding the debt, I said. I paid every cent of it back over 4 years, working 2 jobs while pregnant with my son. I was hired by Howard Lynn. I gestured to him and he nodded, once solemn, who is here tonight, and who believed in my work when it would have been easier for everyone, including me, to believe the story that I'd failed. 8 years ago I made partner. 2 years ago I co-founded Carter Wren Architecture with my colleague Sophia Wren, and tonight we're being recognized for a clinic that will serve thousands of people who needed a building designed with their dignity in mind, not their budget as an afterthought. The room was silent in the particular way rooms go silent when they realize they've just watched something real happen. "I didn't not make it," I said, looking at my father directly for the first time. "I made it exactly the way people who don't get handed anything have to, slowly, and without anyone clapping for the years it took." I set the microphone gently back on its stand. "Thank you all genuinely for this award. It means more to me than I can say tonight." I did not look at my father again as I walked to my seat. I didn't need to see his face to know it. I could feel Howard Lynn's hand find my shoulder as I sat down, steady and brief, the closest thing to a father's pride I had ever actually needed. That was the correction in public. What came 6 weeks later, in a much smaller room, was the reckoning in private, the one built entirely from 14 months of proof. The table. I asked my father to meet me at Eleanor's house in late February 2024. On a Sunday when I knew Brandon would also be visiting, because I wanted Eleanor present, and I wanted no version of this happening behind closed doors where the story could be rewritten later. My mother came too. Aunt Carol came at my quiet request, with the sealed timeline in her purse, though she never had to open it. I laid out 3 things on Eleanor's kitchen table, the same table where she'd once asked me if I'd found out about the will. A printed copy of the spreadsheet I'd photographed. A printed copy of the misdirected text. A single-page summary Uncle Gary had prepared, showing side by side the documented transfers to Brandon's household since 2014 and the documented gifts to mine over the same period. My father's face changed the moment he saw the spreadsheet's header in his own handwriting. Brandon went very pale and did not speak. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," I said, before either of them could. "I'm here because Grandma asked me more than once to make sure things were fair, and because I have a report from an independent doctor confirming she has mild cognitive impairment, which means every financial decision made on her behalf since her attorney was quietly changed in 2021 needs to be reviewed by someone other than the person who benefits from it." "This is insane," my father said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I've done everything for this family. I've managed your grandmother's affairs for years without a single complaint." "You've managed them without a single witness," I said. "That's different." I placed my hand flat on the spreadsheet. "Do not mention isn't the language of managing someone's affairs, Dad. It's the language of hiding something from the people it affects." Eleanor, sitting at the head of her own table, looked at the papers for a long moment, then looked at my father with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not rage, but a kind of sorrowful clarity, the look of someone finally seeing a photograph developed correctly after years of a blurred negative. "Richard," she said quietly, "is this true?" My father did not answer immediately, and in the silence I said the line I had been carrying unplanned, for 14 months without knowing I was carrying it at all. "I stopped needing your applause a long time ago, Dad. I just needed you to stop deciding for everyone else that I'd never earned it." Consequences. My father did not confess dramatically. People rarely do. What he did instead over the following weeks was smaller and in its own way more honest than any speech could have been. He agreed, not gracefully, but he agreed, to a formal accounting of Eleanor's finances conducted by Martin Doyle's office, and to the establishment of an independent trust for her remaining assets, managed by a professional trustee rather than any family member. He did not admit, in so many words, that he'd intended to leave Brandon the larger share of Eleanor's estate. He said instead, "I thought Emily had enough going for her that she didn't need it as much." It was the closest he ever came to an apology, and I understood hearing it that it was probably the closest he was capable of. Brandon called me 3 weeks after the meeting at Eleanor's house, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I knew about some of it," he said. "Not all of it. I told myself Dad was just being generous and that you were fine because you always seemed fine." A long pause. "I let myself believe it because it was easier than admitting I was taking money I didn't need to ask hard questions about." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because saying something meant admitting Dad's approval came with a price tag I wasn't willing to give up." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm not proud of that. It wasn't a full reckoning. But it was more honesty than I'd heard from my brother in a decade, and I let it be enough for a beginning." My mother apologized only once, quietly, in my kitchen without an audience. "I knew things weren't equal," she said. "I told myself it wasn't my business to fix your father's ledger. I should have said something a long time ago." I believed her. I also understood that believing her and forgiving her fully were two separate processes, and I gave myself permission to take both slowly. Some apologies came. Some never did. What mattered more, in the months that followed, was what actually changed and what stayed exactly stubbornly the same. 6 months later. By August of 2024, Eleanor's independent trust was fully established, overseen by a professional fiduciary Martin's office recommended, with quarterly statements sent directly to Eleanor, myself, Brandon, and Aunt Carol, full transparency, built into the structure itself, so no single person could ever again be the only one who knew the truth. My father attended Thanksgiving that year at Brandon's house, not mine. An arrangement that felt less like punishment and more like the natural distance two people create when one of them is no longer willing to absorb the other's version of events without correction. We spoke, but carefully, the way you speak to someone you're still deciding how much to let back into your life. Tyler, Brandon and Chelsea's son, 17 that year, asked me once at a smaller family dinner why Grandpa didn't come around as much anymore. I told him the truth in language appropriate for a 17-year-old, that adults sometimes make unfair decisions and have a hard time admitting it, and that our family was learning slowly how to be honest instead of comfortable. He nodded like it made more sense to him than I expected. Max, 15 by then, brought it up once too, unprompted, while helping me clear the dinner table. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. The award thing. I wanted to yell at him. I told him. I just decided a long time ago that yelling gives someone else the story to tell about you afterward. Staying calm made the truth the only story left. He thought about that for a while, then said, I'm gonna remember that, in the offhand way teenagers say the things that end up mattering most. 1 year later. Eleanor's 90th birthday in the spring of 2025 was quiet and small. Exactly the way she wanted it. Dan grilling in her backyard, Lucy and Tyler running through the sprinkler, Aunt Carol's green bean casserole finally getting the credit it deserved from everyone at the table. My father came. He brought a card, not a toast, which felt from him like genuine restraint. He did not mention Cole Carter design. He did not call me anything except my name, which I understood by then to be the largest gift he currently had the capacity to give. Carter Wren Architecture broke ground that spring on a second Hilltop project, a community library extension, and Howard Lynn, 72 by then and fully retired, came to the ribbon cutting anyway, leaning on his cane, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd known I was good since before she knew it herself. Eleanor, sharp that afternoon in the particular way she still had on her good days, pulled me aside near the end of the party and squeezed my hand. You made it fair, she said. I always knew you would. You were the one who noticed when something wasn't right, even when you were small enough that nobody thought you'd remember it. I remembered everything, Grandma. I know, she said. That's why I trusted you with it. 3 years later. Eleanor passed peacefully in the spring of 2027 at 92, in the house on Deschler Avenue she'd never agreed to leave. Her estate, held in the independent trust for 3 years by then, was distributed exactly as her final, clearly documented wishes specified, and even split between Brandon and me, a bequest to Aunt Carol, and a smaller gift to Tyler for his college fund, given openly, with no spreadsheet mark do not mention anywhere in the paperwork. My relationship with my father remains, even now, quieter than it once was, and I've made a kind of peace with that. He comes to birthdays. He sends cards. He has never, in 3 years, said the words I was wrong to call you the one who didn't make it, and I no longer wait for those exact words the way I once did. What I've learned to notice instead is smaller, steadier evidence. The way he now introduces me at family gatherings simply as my daughter the architect, no punchline attached, no detour mentioned. It isn't everything. It also isn't nothing. Carter Wren Architecture has 7 employees now. Max is 19, studying structural engineering of all things, and tells people when it comes up that his mother designs buildings and doesn't let people push her around, which is a description I've decided to be proud of even though it's not entirely how I'd put it myself. Lucy is 13 and still asks, every Christmas, to help set the table with whatever china we now consider the good china, a small tradition she inherited from a great-grandmother who made sure, before she left, that fairness outlived her. What remained? People sometimes ask me, when this story comes up, whether I regret how long it took me to act, 14 months of quiet documentation before a single confrontation, years before that of simply absorbing the story my father told about me without correcting it. I don't regret the years. I think they built the patience that made the correction possible at all. What I understand now that I didn't understand at 29, sitting in a kitchen being told I'd rushed into things, is that the people who call you reckless for needing help are very often the same people quietly deciding behind closed doors how much help you're allowed to need. I stopped needing my father's applause the day I realized his silence was the only inheritance he'd ever truly offered me on his own terms. Everything else, the folder, the timeline, the trust, the truth, I built myself the way I've built everything worth having. That's the whole of it. That's how the one who didn't make it ended up making the only thing that mattered. A family, however imperfect, that finally has to be honest to stay a family at all. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one quietly written out of a family's version of fairness, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There's always another family, another folder, another quiet decision waiting to be told. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.